they're spending $1.2 million per citizen in the United States, you start to realize that that money is buying the Qataris' goodwill across the country. And that's going to prevent them from being held accountable for the Hamas sponsorship, the Taliban support, all of the bad things they do. They're not going to be held accountable for, because in the minds of American policymakers and everyday Americans, they're just generous people from the Gulf who support America and create jobs, and foreign investment is a good thing. That's just a startling fact to me, that this teeny tiny country in the Gulf has spent $2 billion more than China on the American higher education system. And the anecdote that I always like to draw attention to happened at Georgetown University. Georgetown has absorbed about $1 billion from Qatar since that campus was founded 20-some years ago. And last year, Georgetown awarded the mother of the Qatari emir, her name is Sheikha Moza. Georgetown awarded her a prestigious award from the president of the university. Yahya Sinwar, the Hamas chief, the mastermind of the October 7th attacks, was killed. Sheikha Moza, this woman who received the award from Georgetown, publicly eulogized him on X. I don't think giving an award to a Hamas sympathizer aligns with Georgetown's core values and principles.
Welcome to Passages Pulse, where we track the heartbeat of Israel and the Middle East from a Christian perspective. In a time of confusion, division, and misinformation, we're here to help you cut through the noise with truth, clarity, and conviction.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Passages Pulse. My name is Josiah McGee. I'm the co-host of the Passages Pulse, and I'm here with a special guest who I'll introduce in just a moment. But before we get into that, I just want to let you know that today is Tuesday, June 30th. We are recording this episode at the end of the month of June, a month which has been quite busy in terms of news coming out of the Middle East, especially as it relates to events happening in Iran and more recently in Lebanon. We will be getting into all of that next week, so please stay tuned. But today we want to spend some time with our special guest talking about a special topic. We're here today with Natalie Eckenow. Natalie Eckenow is the Senior Research Analyst at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, focusing on the Middle East and the Gulf. She holds a BA in Political Science from Duke University and an MA in Security Studies from Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service. Thank you, Natalie, for joining us. And before we jump in, I always want to give guests the opportunity to correct me if I have butchered your name in any way, to make sure the audience knows how to actually pronounce it. So if I got it incorrect, please correct me. If not, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. My last name is actually Econo, like economy, but it's butchered 99% of the time, so I don't really care.
See, this is why I ask. Thank you for being gracious and correcting the record so everyone actually knows how to say it correctly. We invited Natalie to be here because she recently wrote a memo titled Mapping Qatar's $400 billion Footprint in the United States. And as I was discussing with her just before we hit record, I'm very grateful that she wrote this because there's been a lot of chatter about this subject. Honestly, some of the people that I've talked to about this, not all, but some of them sound a little bit like conspiracy nuts because they talk a lot about it, but don't actually have the evidence or the proof of a lot of this foreign funding and the impact that it's having. So I really appreciate Natalie doing the work to actually help us understand what's real, what's sensationalism or borderline conspiracies. And in order to do that, you have to actually follow the money and check some of the receipts. Natalie has done that work for us regarding Qatar's money. So we're going to jump right in and give her an opportunity to explain what she's found and what it all means. Natalie, I want to start by asking you just a process-related question. How do you actually follow the money? I mean, I'm sure it's a very complicated process given the scale of what you're studying and the complexity of money crossing, digital or imaginary borders, so to speak. How do you collect receipts and figure out what's actually going on?
Yeah, so I actually, before I explain sort of how I did this, I want to touch on something you said about sensationalism and the need to actually cull receipts and put them all in one place and really have a bank of evidence to then analyze and assess when talking about Qatari money and Qatari influence. And that was my mindset when I started this project, which is why all of the data that's in my report, it's all open source. Anyone can go find it. All the links are in my database. You can click on the links. You can follow the money yourself. None of this took any special investigative skills or scoops or sources that I couldn't necessarily expose because we wanted everything to be visible and accessible for anyone who sees the report. That's not to say it's an easy process. The report itself took me over a year to put together, nearly 2 years actually when I think about it. And the way I went about it was a few ways. So, certain categories of investment or certain ways the Qataris deploy their money get captured by federal level disclosures. So, education is sort of, I think, what people probably are most familiar with. There's a piece of legislation that requires American colleges and universities to disclose money they receive from foreign governments over a certain dollar amount. All of that information is publicly available on the Department of Education's website. And the Department of Education itself actually is sort of transforming the way that they present this data to the public. So earlier this year, there was a dashboard that was launched online. You can find it yourself. I think it's like foreignfundinghighered.gov, something like that. And there's graphs and charts, and you can download the bulk data, and it's really easy to see for yourself who's giving, what countries are giving money to which schools. Lobbying in public relations, there's a piece of legislation called the Foreign Agents Registration Act, or FARA. When lobbyists or PR firms do work on behalf of a foreign government or a foreign principal, they need to disclose that. All of that information is found on the Department of Justice website. It's a little bit more difficult to gather that data because there are many different types of forms. And, the whole process is very human. So different firms and companies fill out the forms in different ways. So it requires months of manual work, knowing what to look for, going through those forms. Beyond the databases, it's just a lot of patience monitoring the news, looking for press releases, going back in like the web archive to find, maybe a grant that was made in 2010. And a big piece of that is knowing which investment vehicles to look for. So certain things are obvious. The Qatari Sovereign Wealth Fund, Qatar Investment Authority. If you just search the word Qatar, that's going to come up. But other investment vehicles that you'll find in my report don't have the word Qatar, don't say Doha, don't say Al Thani, and yet they're tied either directly to the government, as in they're a state entity, or they are entities that are run by Qatari royals, which for the purposes of my report, I also included. So it's also learning the landscape and knowing what organizations and entities the Qataris use to spread their wealth in the United States.
Right. So this is key. I think I'm hearing a couple of things that I want to draw attention to right away. One is that in order to do this research, you sort of have to do your homework first on the country that you're studying before you can begin to follow the money that they're spending. So understanding the ins and outs of the royal family, of the various state corporations that work for them, for lack of a better term. Yeah, that's obviously key. The other thing that stands out, and I noticed this in the memo as well, is that you made a comment or two, as well as I believe Jonathan did in the prelude to it, that the scope of funding is actually probably larger than what you reported, but you only reported those things that you could get receipts for, which I think is something I want to draw attention to, because that's part of why I make this argument that this memo is important, is because it is drawing a line between that which you can prove and that which you think might be true but can't necessarily prove. It is important to make that distinction, frankly, for the credibility of reports like these. So I do just want to note that this report is a conservative estimate, in your own words, and is based only on those things that you could actually find and demonstrate to be true or prove to be true. A follow-up question I want to ask you, though, you mentioned having to go back into the archives years, or even sounds like more than a decade past, in order to find some of this research. So when did this money start to flow to the United States? And I mean, over time, have you seen differences in terms of how much on average they might spend in the United States on a yearly basis?
Yeah. So the report itself, the money dates back to the early 2000s. So it's 2.5 decades, let's say. But I would say the vast majority of the money that I tracked came into the country after 2010. The reason why that I extended it back to 2000 is there are a couple reasons. First, in the higher education space, a huge piece of the puzzle is the 6 American schools that have campuses overseas in Doha. That is important for many reasons, but those satellite campuses were set up. All of them were set up before 2010. So if you exclude those from the tracker, you're missing a huge piece of the puzzle, and in the education space at least, a huge way that the Qataris attempt to exercise influence, or at least it's part of sort of this influence orbit. The other reason I extended it back is because one of the ways the Qataris spread not necessarily a large dollar amount of money, but I think one of the most impactful, I don't know if impactful is the right word, but one of the most significant things that I saw in terms of potential impact or potential influence is what the Qataris do in the disaster relief space. Multiple times over the course of the last 20 plus years, when there has been a major natural disaster, the Qataris have set up a dedicated fund to help that community, the impacted community or communities, recover. One of those disasters, of course, was Hurricane Katrina, and Hurricane Katrina happened before 2010. So I thought it was important to sort of capture that in my data set. There's also Hurricane Harvey and other things that happened after 2010, but Katrina was sort of a major one. I do want to say, in terms of the dollar amount being a conservative estimate, it's not just that there were certain ventures that I couldn't necessarily prove through a receipt, or I knew that the Qataris were part of, but I didn't necessarily know the dollar amount. So the $400 billion is actually an undercount. It's also that in many cases, a dollar amount or a range of dollar amounts was available, and I took the absolute minimum that it could possibly be. And so it's very possible that the Qataris actually spent more than I recorded for that venture. A good example of this is in the think tank space. Many foreign governments and foreign entities donate to think tanks in Washington. And this is another example of how I did this work, but that information is usually found in the organization's annual report. Normally, donors are listed in a donor range, like 10,000 to 50,000. 50,000 to 100,000, something like that. And when the Qataris fell in a bracket like that, I took the lowest amount. So let's say it was, 10 to 50,000 was one donor bracket. I recorded that as 10,000. Totally possible it could have been 50,000. Another space where I did something of that sort is when I found the number of shares that the Qatari entity held in a certain US company. I found the lowest possible share price for the last year and used that to calculate a dollar amount. Now, share prices fluctuate, and it's hard to actually peg a dollar amount regardless of whether or not you're going for a maximum or a minimum. But in this case, it is a minimum based on the data that I could find online. So it's not just that, there are, stones that might have not been turned over or certain things where a dollar amount isn't reported. It's that I also erred on the side of caution with every number that I did put in the report. So I would venture to guess the number is much, much higher than 400 billion, not just marginally higher.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Thank you for clarifying that. I think it, especially in the think tank space, that did stand out when I was reading your memo as well, that it is easy to tell that they're spending money, hard to tell how much money they're spending. It makes sense that you have to sort of figure out how to make, the best estimate that can actually be, definitively proven true without sort of speculating about how high those numbers may go. And I agree. I would think, given the range that you're describing, the difference between 10 and 50,000 is pretty significant as a bracket. So that the range likely is significantly higher. But that's another conversation, I suppose, about how think tanks are reporting their donors. The 2010 mark to me is interesting. And I don't know if there's any particular significance to that or not. I know, I am asking you to venture a little bit into the realm of speculation with this question, but I'm going to go and ask anyways. Do you have any idea like why at that point the numbers started to increase or spending started to accelerate?
So 2010 itself, I mean, I could theorize and hypothesize. It's also a loose 2010. It's just sort of in my brain when I was doing the research. That's kind of like the moment in time that I pegged. I do think the Qataris have grown closer to the United States over the years, and I'm sure as that bilateral relationship has tightened, so too has the money started, the flow of the money has started to increase. I don't necessarily know if that's true, but what I do know is there have been certain points since 2010 where there has been a marked increase in Qatari dollars. The most prominent moment would be 2017. There was a rift in the Gulf. Saudi Arabia and the UAE and a couple of other countries imposed a blockade on Qatar. They issued a series of demands, and the Saudis and the Emiratis already had pretty extensive lobbying wings in the United States. The Qataris had some lobbyists, but at least compared to the Saudis, not as much. And they started to catch up and try to win favor with the US government during this rift. So you do see an uptick, at least in the FARA database, of the Qataris adding more and more lobbyists, more and more public relations experts to their payrolls. So that's a significant uptick that isn't anecdotal that I did see in the data. I would say there's been, an influx in the last few years, just in terms as the Qataris became major non-NATO allies, as they became more, I would say since October 7th, the Qataris have become more of a known entity in the minds of, Americans who just maybe aren't in the weeds of this stuff every day, but pay attention to the news and follow the Middle East. They probably are starting to notice the Qataris more than they had in the past. And that's obviously invited some criticism on the Qataris. And I did see an uptick in the FARA database again. of the Qataris trying to combat the allegations of influence, particularly in the education space, since October 2023, promoting their role in hostage talks, things like that. So when world events happen or when they come under particular scrutiny, the 2022 World Cup is another good example that, the lead up to the Cup put a spotlight on the Qataris, not necessarily for great reasons. One, corruption. Two, labor rights abuse. So they started to try to combat those allegations. So when things happen that warrant a response, you tend to see more money, at least in the Ferris space.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think if you're going back to the early 2010s, I mean, it makes sense that you would see a bit of a shift in terms of its priorities. It was a pretty turbulent period in the Middle East. You had the Arab Spring. Obviously, Qatar is both a monarchy and close to the Muslim Brotherhood, which was behind a lot of the revolutions in the Arab Spring during the early 2010s. So it was a pretty complex system that Qatar was trying to manage, and also a pretty complicated set of pressures it was under as well. So it makes sense that it was having to sort of figure out how to create some stability for itself in those circumstances or under those conditions. That being said, I want to dig into a little bit more. You've already referenced several examples, lobbying, education, natural disaster relief as well. But are there any other significant recipients of Qatar's money that we maybe haven't discussed yet you think we should be highlighting, as far as, who are the biggest recipients of this foreign funding?
Yeah, so I think I think it depends how you define significant. If you define significant as just sheer dollar amount, the answer is different than if you define significant as potential for influence or even malign influence. In terms of sheer dollar amount, the sectors that have absorbed the most Qatari money would be defense, energy, real estate. The Qataris have placed, over 100 billion, if not 200 billion dollars worth of Boeing orders, things like that. In terms of potential for influence, media is one, lobbying is one. I would argue to an extent education is ripe for influence. There are many categories that sort of fall in the gray area between investment and influence. You also could define significant in terms of geographic hotspots for Qatari money, right? So South Carolina, outside of the normal defense relationship with the United States, Al Udeid Air Base, which the Qatar Al Udeid is in Doha or outside of Doha. It's our largest base. The Qataris have spent money maintaining that base. That's included in my tracker, even though geographically it's overseas. It is an American base. They buy a lot of American weapons, but outside of that, there is a lot of Qatari funded defense activity in South Carolina. So the Qatari state defense firm runs a subsidiary based in Charleston, and they have what's essentially a drone research and development facility that the Qataris have spent money on down there. It's millions of dollars, which is peanuts compared to hundreds of billions, but it's still Qatari money. And it's interesting to think that there is this small defense related industry being funded by the Qataris down in South Carolina. Texas is a hotspot for energy. I think that obvious reasons, a lot of American energy production is down in Texas. New York is a hotspot for real estate. There is a lot of Qatari investment going into Silicon Valley. Small in terms of dollar amount, but interesting nonetheless. I saw a lot of Qatari business to business efforts down in Florida. So there are certain states that have been attracting more Qatari attention than others. That's not to say some states are completely immune. I think the money has touched almost all of the states in the country, but there certainly are hotspots geographically where I saw more Qatari activity than others.
It makes sense. I mean, I think to your point, the line between investment and influence is pretty blurry when you're talking about foreign direct investment. Obviously, the goal is not just to generate profit, but also to create closer ties between two countries so that there are more shared interests that can be called upon in the event of a crisis. And these geographic hotspots you're referring to really are sort of like nodes of influence for the entire country. To your point, I mean, yes, Texas is massively important as far as our national energy output. New York, massively important in terms of finance, real estate, those sorts of things. South Carolina is interesting. I mean, you don't necessarily think of it as one of the most important states, no offense, in terms of economic output. But from a defense industry standpoint, yeah, that absolutely makes sense. South Carolina does have a pretty long connection to our military and our defense industry, both in terms of manufacturing and bases in South Carolina. So targeting areas that are historically, again, nodes of influence as far as our national economy, it's very interesting to see them doing that. And I would agree that's significant, even if the dollar numbers are low, because they are pressure points that they can They can press if need be. I guess that leads to the next question, though. They're not the only country directing foreign investment into the United States. So they're not the only person doing this. This by itself does not necessarily sound unique. You've referenced several other countries, including Middle Eastern countries or Gulf countries that do the same. The investment in many cases has been invited by the United States. So it's not like they're sneaking in the back door the same way that you could argue certain Chinese companies have. So I guess the question is, why should we be concerned about this? If this is foreign direct investment that in many cases has been relatively public, even invited by our companies or our governments, why are we concerned about Qatar's money being funneled into the United States in these ways?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the question. And in order to answer it, I think everyone needs to understand, like, where is the country of Qatar? Who are they? Like, why are we spotlighting this country? So Qatar is extremely small. There are approximately 330,000 citizens. The rest of the population, which is only a couple million, are migrant workers. So before I go on, just the statistic that I want to put out there is $400 billion, 330,000 citizens. That equates to about $1.2 million per Qatari citizen. That, as far as I'm aware, outpaces the
Pretty
Saudis
high.
and the Emiratis in terms of per capita investment in the United States. But beyond the per capita investment and just like the scale of it, the Qataris are major non-NATO allies. As I mentioned, they host our largest base in the region. The Trump administration extended a security assurance to them last fall. For all intents and purposes, they're not just an ally in good standing, but a prestigious ally of the United States. However, at the same time, the Qataris are longtime sponsors of Hamas. They're patrons of the Taliban. As you mentioned, they're, sort of a wing of the Muslim Brotherhood. They're close with Russia. They partner with China. Up until the current war, they've been vocally supportive of Iran. A part of that, you could argue one way or another, do they have to be because the Iran and Qatar share the natural gas field. You might argue that just means they partner with the Iranians, they have no choice. But you could also argue that that geographic fact incentivizes the Qataris to, keep the regime afloat, because if the regime is, unable to leverage their side of the field the same way the Qataris are, the Qataris have essentially no economic competitor. And they get their wealth from this natural gas from reserve. So that's a debate for another day. But they do have a working relationship. Up until the war, they had a working relationship with the Iranians. And then while my report, all the data in there is above board, clean, nothing's illegal, the Qataris have been entangled in corruption schemes. I mentioned FIFA. The way they, bribed their way to host the World Cup has been widely reported. The Qataris were named in the scandal that brought down former Senator Robert Menendez. There's a sprawling corruption scheme that happened in Europe it's colloquially called Qatargate. There's another scheme that sort of impacted the Netanyahu government in Israel. So it's not like they only play clean. Like there is some element of dirtiness happening. And I think that goes to the point of, why are the Qataris spending this much money and what are they trying to buy? Certain cases, it's very clear. I go to Farah again. That money is clearly being spent to influence policymakers. It's legal, but it's influence. The money that's clearly investment, sure, the Qataris probably just want to get a return on their money. But I think when you put the whole picture together and you think about the fact that this country that's playing both arsonist and firefighter, they're spending $1.2 million per citizen in the United States, you start to realize that money is buying the Qataris' goodwill across the country. Not even nefariously, just it's human nature. The Qataris are creating jobs in one community or helping another community recover from a hurricane. There's going to be goodwill that's created. And you're going to start to think about the Qataris, if you think about them at all, as the firefighter and not the arsonist. And that's going to prevent them from being held accountable for the Hamas sponsorship, the Taliban support, all of the bad things they do. They're not going to be held accountable for, because in the minds of American policymakers and everyday Americans, they're just generous people from the Gulf who support America and create jobs, and foreign investment is a good thing. And I think that's the broader issue. It's not necessarily certain. There are certain cases where I think that there has been malign influence, and I can get into those in a bit if you would like. But I think the bigger issue is the lack of accountability rather than each individual thing buying something nefarious. And I think going back to that sensationalist point you made earlier on, I think a lot of times when people talk about Qatari money and Qatari influence, not only are there no receipts, but they jump from, okay, well, there was a grant made here and there was a bad outcome, therefore the grant must have bought the bad outcome. It's not necessarily always that clear. The grant might not have bought that bad outcome. It's just an over time, a gradual process of elevating the firefighter side of the Qataris and downgrading the arsonist side when they really need to both be seen front and center.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I would be curious to hear more of your thoughts on this question about, malign influence that they have engaged in parsing out the difference between that and non-nefarious investment spending. I think what is interesting before we get into that, if you take a look at the last few years as far as the relationship that the US has had with the government of Qatar, is that it does seem to have escaped some accountability. And to your point, you use the word accountability as being a key. What they may be buying is not necessarily a specific outcome, but a lack of accountability when it is necessary because of the goodwill that they have generated through their spending. And the specific examples I'm thinking of are, for example, allowing the government of Qatar, the various ministers who are members of the royal family, to mediate negotiations between Hamas and Israel after the October 7 war, while at the same time they were actively playing host and had been sponsoring or even helping to fund members of Hamas for years prior to that. It's a little weird. I mean, in any other situation, I think we would say that seems kind of weird, like a conflict of interest. That can't be totally above board. Why is that allowed, or why are we putting up with this? And then you begin to understand, I think, a little bit more so where this lack of accountability becomes an issue. That's the kind of situation where the conflict of interest becomes a little bit more clear, even if it's not clear that there's always a conflict of interest in their funding. If the goodwill that they're generating through their spending is allowing them to engage in those sorts of conflicts of interest without the United States saying, I don't think that's really how that should work, then we do have a bit of a problem here in terms of its impact on U.S. foreign policy in the region. I want to give you a chance, though. You mentioned there may be some specific cases in which you think there is actual malign influence to their spending. So before we wrap up, I want to give you a chance to touch on that if you'd like to.
Yeah, so I think outside of the clear-cut lobbying spend, where I saw the most influence is in the education space, both higher education, and something I haven't mentioned is the money that the Qataris spend in the K-12 space. It's millions of dollars, not billions of dollars. It's pocket change, but it does go a long way. So I'll start with the higher education space. The Qataris have spent, by the Department of Education's own records, close to $9 billion in U.S. colleges and universities. That not only makes them the top foreign funders of American universities, but they outpaced China by about $2 billion. Now, this was last I checked. The database might have been updated in the last couple of weeks, but that's just a startling fact to me that this teeny tiny country in the Gulf has spent $2 billion more than China on the American higher education system. And the anecdote that I always like to draw attention to happened at Georgetown University. Georgetown is one of the handful of American schools that has a satellite campus in Doha. Georgetown has absorbed about $1 billion from Qatar since that campus was founded 20-some years ago. And last year, Georgetown awarded the mother of the Qatari emir, her name is Sheikha Moza. Georgetown awarded her a prestigious award from the president of the university. What's interesting about this is this happened last spring, I believe. The previous fall, so this would have been fall 2024, if I'm doing the math correctly, Yahya Sinwar, the Hamas chief, the mastermind of the October 7th attacks, was killed. Sheikha Moza, this woman who received the award from Georgetown, publicly eulogized him on X. I don't think giving an award to a Hamas sympathizer aligns with Georgetown's core values and principles. Not saying the Qataris paid for the award, they probably didn't. But what I think did happen is that the amount of Qatari money that poured into the university blinded the Qataris to this woman's blinded Georgetown to this woman's record, or sort of just naturally, gradually over time led them to betray their own values. And to make matters worse, the president of Georgetown was asked during congressional testimony after the award ceremony, like, why did you give this woman the award? Didn't you know about the things she put out on social media? And he essentially brushed aside the Hamas support and said, well, we weren't awarding her. We didn't give her the award for anything related to that. We gave her the award because of all the great work she's done to bring education to youth around the world, which she has. That's a true statement, but that shouldn't negate the fact that she did publicly support a terror chief with not just Israeli blood, but American blood on his hands. So that to me is an example of malign influence There are many others that exist in the higher education space. There's been at least one congressional report that's highlighted how Qatari money has impacted Northwestern and Georgetown in terms of allowing anti-Semitism to fester, inhibiting free speech, things like that. In the K-12 space, there have been multiple public school classrooms that have used a curriculum in Arabic. I think it's Arabic language and culture curriculum funded by the Qataris. And in those classrooms, there are maps of the Middle East that don't include the state of Israel. I don't think that fact needs much explanation because the state of Israel does exist. So that to me is another clear example of influence. And even worse, it's, in elementary school classrooms. So those would be clear examples of influence. I'm sure there's many more, but I think those are the most startling. And I think the ones that probably will catch most Americans' attention because you might not go to the Hill every day and engage with Qatari lobbyists, but you do engage with the American. Almost every American has engaged or will engage with the American school system. So I think that is the most important example to highlight when it comes to how this money might potentially lead to malign influence.
Well, let's end our conversation on this specific issue then, and I'm going to ask you for some practical responses to it then, because I would agree. I think the area in which there's the most visibility, the most touch points, or the most potential impact on the everyday American is probably not in massive real estate purchases or investment in oil firms or whatever. It's in the classroom. I mean, to your point, K through 12. If that becomes widespread, then that has potential for widespread influence over the average American. What sort of practical guardrails do you think are required in order to address that specific issue then? Their funding of different education projects. And what can realistically be done in order to put those guardrails in place?
Yeah, so in terms of what can realistically be done, it's definitely an uphill battle. I think, we've spoken about how the Qataris generally are seen as good allies amongst American policymakers. So starting to move the needle on that is difficult. And it's a bipartisan issue. I think there's a lot of spotlight right now on the Republicans and Trump and the way the Qataris are influencing them or potentially influencing them. And I think that's because, right now the Republicans are in power and the Qataris, of course, want to have the favor of the people in power. But it's an issue on the left as well. I mean, I mentioned Menendez. That's just one example of someone on the left who, sort of was in the Qataris' orbit. So it's an issue on both sides, which is why it's a particular challenge, because it's not like a new administration will come in or a new Congress will come in and all of a sudden it's like, oh, well, this isn't an issue in your guys' party, so now we can actually get something done. It's a big issue. And like I said, the money has gone to so many corners of this country that it's I imagine very hard for an elected official from, let's say an area impacted by Hurricane Harvey that was rehabilitated because of Qatari money to then get to Washington and start to lay down the law on the Qataris. Like his constituents are probably very grateful for that Qatari largesse and, it could risk his political future. So it is a challenge. I think step number one is just transparency. That I think is the biggest issue. I think most Americans don't really know where Qatari money is. They don't realize they're engaging with Qatari money as frequently as they probably are. One anecdote that I always like to give is the Qataris are the majority owners of Miramax Films. And one time I went home from work and I turned on Netflix and I, turned on a new movie and the opening credit was for this entity called BN Media. BN Media spun off of Al Jazeera. So like just in that one night, I wasn't doing anything political. It was like a rom-com and there it was front and center, the Qataris were involved with this. So I think just transparency, getting Americans to know when and where they're engaging with this money is important. And I think education is a good place to start. There are not transparency requirements in the K-12 space the same way there is in the higher education space. The money that's in my report was uncovered through public records requests. That obviously takes time and effort and money in some cases. And we also only got, returns from a small slice of the school districts in America. So the problem is probably much larger than my report suggests. We just didn't survey all of, the thousands of school districts in the country. So transparency is step number one. I think there are certain things that the government can do that don't necessarily relate to Qatari money, but that will hold the Qataris accountable. The first thing that comes to mind is Al Jazeera, the Qatari state media organization. They have what is basically a subsidiary in the United States called AJ Plus. In 2020, the Department of Justice asked or ordered AJ Plus to register as a foreign agent. AJ Plus has yet to register as a foreign agent. It is now 2026. So forcing them to just comply with the law, that seems to me to be an easy step. So there are things that the U.S. government can do to start holding the Qataris accountable while hopefully enacting more legislation that requires just transparency.
Yeah, I think it makes sense. To your point about AJ Plus, I imagine one of the concerns people have is, the First Amendment and that sort of thing. But I do think it's just important to clarify that these are fairly common sense solutions, because AJ Plus is not just a news outlet. It is a news outlet that is essentially part of the official media arm of the state of Qatar. Al Jazeera is not independent. It is funded by and appears to be fairly tightly controlled by the state of Qatar. So you're talking about basically, allowing a PR firm that works for, or the communications officials that work for the state of a foreign country to operate with no guardrails or restrictions. I mean, that's very different than freedom of the press in the United States as we conceive it under the First Amendment. So
I also should note too, as far as I'm not a lawyer, but as far as I understand, registering under FARA doesn't actually prevent AJ Plus from operating the way they've been operating. It's just disclosure. It's just you just need to know the U.S. government. If you happen to go to the database, you'll know that this operation is run by a foreign government. But it's not going to change or constrain limit the way that AJ Plus spreads its content. So it's really like low-hanging fruit that shouldn't be as complicated as it apparently has been.
Right. Yeah, it's a very good point. It's not about censoring as much as it is just requiring the transparency and accountability that if you're going to operate as essentially a branch of Qatar's foreign lobbying operation, that you should be labeled and defined as such, and not escaping that label and pretending to be something that it's not. So I think that's an excellent point. I really appreciate all of these insights, Natalie. I'm looking at the time. I think we probably should be respectful of your time and wrap this conversation up. But thank you for spending this time with us and for answering my questions about your report. I personally have learned quite a bit in reading what you've put together and in discussing this with you. I hope the rest of our listeners have as well. We will link to Natalie's full memo in the show notes. If anyone listening would like to learn more or follow up on the work that she's doing, you can follow her work on the Foundation for Defense of Democracy's website as well. I want to thank Lindsay for producing this episode for us. We appreciate your help as always. And of course, everyone listening, thank you for doing so. And we will see you all next week.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Passages Pulse. Passages seeks to prepare and empower a new generation of Christian leaders who love God, stand with the Jewish people, and support Israel. To learn more about Passages, follow us on social media or visit www.passagesisrael.org. Until next time, we'll keep you connected to the pulse.